Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture, we are going to look at, we're going to continue looking at, I'll continue our discussion of the mid 20th century civil rights movement, and we're going to continue our discourse on the events surrounding Bloody Sunday, Bloody Sunday, the attack on the marchers as they approached the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Orchestrated by police on horseback. Now, a week after the events horrified American audiences, President Johnson announced to the nation on television that he was submitting to Congress a comprehensive bill calling for voting rights protection. In his words, their cause must be our cause too, because it's not just Negroes, but it's really all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. President Johnson went on to say that in words that seemed to be aimed directly at George Wallace in particular, it's wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country. And the president then concluded his address with the words, "We shall overcome." And again, he was sort of drawing on that powerful rhetoric that Martin Luther King employed in so many of his speeches. "We shall overcome" is a prominent African American spiritual. Free at last, thank God Almighty is a words also in another very prominent African American spiritual. So President Johnson chiming in very effectively, I would say, on this matter, very decisively, very direct, very effective. Johnson's speech was radical to say the least. Never before had a sitting president so unapologetically aligned himself with the cause of civil rights. On March 21st, King and the marchers returned to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. This time, they were accompanied by federal marshals and federal troops. King led the now 25,000 marchers from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, without violent incident. That summer, on August 6, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voter Rights Act, which would serve as the second and really the last major piece of civil rights legislation in the 1960s. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was one of the most sweeping pieces of legislation in the history of the Republic. It banned literacy tests and put the federal government on the forefront, on the front lines of voter registration, allowing federal examiners to investigate voter rolls where more than 50% of the local population did not show up on the registration records. This act, together with the 24th Amendment, which was ratified in 1964, and the 1966 Supreme Court case of Harper v. Virginia Board of Elections, banned poll taxes, ending the last ruses to deny African Americans from registering and then exercising their right to vote. Together, they fulfilled the promises of the 14th Amendment and reversed a century of Jim Crow laws and really heralded the demise of legal segregation in the Republic. The high water mark of the nonviolent protest, of the conservative aims of the mid 20th century civil rights movement were achieved in those two pieces of and those series, I should say, of legislation. That series of legislation. 24th Amendment, Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voters' Rights Act of 1965. Now, during this time, there was still a lot of taught tension, racial and ethnic tension in the United States. 5 days after the signing of the Civil Rights Act, a city on the other side of the nation, where a very different form of segregation was enforced through the practice rather than law. The Watts riots of Los Angeles, which were triggered by police brutality, ushered in a new, more confrontational phase of the of African American unrest. It ushered in this new confrontational phase of the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century. Um, and it showed that African Americans outside of the Southeast were feeling the strains of American racial segregation, of American Jim Crow. Um, and it also enlightened many other people that this problem just wasn't a problem in the Southeast, that you just couldn't point your finger at one particular region. This was something that had manifested throughout the nation, almost like cancerous tumors. Um, During the 20th century, two conflicting ideals battled one another for dominance in the African American community. One was centered on the teachings of men like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, based on integrated multicultural society in the United States, free of prejudice, discrimination, where full political and economic opportunity and participation were guaranteed to African Americans. The means to accomplish this was political advocacy, nonviolent protest, Christian love, appealing for constitutional protections, frequent use of the legal system, acceptance of liberal European Americans into their ranks. The integration of policy reached its zenith under Martin Luther King Jr. in the early 60s and the late 1950s. On the other side of the equation, the other idea in the African American community was the message of contained communal self-determination that stems from the teachings of Marcus Garvey and disseminated through the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Now, while the integrationist policy hinged on changing the hearts and minds of segregationists, the separatist policy deemed the segregationists as eternally hostile, unredeemable to the social aspirations of the African American community. Now, while the integrationists advocated for a non-violent approach to the aggression of the segregationists, the separatists followed a fight fire with fire policy. This policy denounced turning the other cheek and advocated for armed resistance to infringements towards liberty and threats to life. They also envisioned different futures for the African American community. Separatists wanted to create a separate, independent sphere for African Americans to engage in politics and economics. The separatist policy would really peak in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and it's found its greatest leader in Malcolm X. Now, as can be expected, the advocates of the two policies existed in an uneasy tension with one another. They mutually respected each other, and they mutually suspected each other of betraying their cause. The two principal figures, King and X, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, held the fundamental ideas of political equality for blacks, for African Americans, African American self-respect and dignity, and of course, increased economic opportunities. They disrupted capitalism as a means to achieve economic equality and respected the abilities of each other. But they sharply disagreed on a great many things. King felt that the militancy of the separatists would provoke violence towards the African American community, and X, for his part, ridiculed the idea of practicing pacifism against those who delighted in violence. Malcolm X compared the policies to the old divisions within the slave plantation, with the integrationists being house slaves, who were privileged by living in the plantation house and hoped the worst aspects of slavery will simply die out. And the separatists to Malcolm X were the field hands, the field slaves, who lived apart from the slave owners and held no illusions of ever being accepted by them. Whether you accept Malcolm X's point or not, there is an underlying truth to his metaphor. Both groups were diametrically opposed to each other's hopes for the future. Their home bases were also different. The integrationists were mainly in the rural southeast, and the separatists were mainly in the northeastern urban centers. They even had opposing religions. For the most part, most of the integrationists practiced Christianity, and most of the separatists practiced Islam. And that brings us to one of the most controversial groups in American history, one of the most controversial and revolutionary groups, I would say, in American history. Controversial and revolutionary, the Nation of Islam. Now, the history of African American separatists begins with them. It begins in the 20th century with the Back to Africa movement under Marcus Garvey and Islam, and this return to West African Islamic roots. When the African slaves were first brought to the American colonies, to the British North American colonies in the 1600s, they practiced indigenous faiths based on ancestor worship. The majority of them practiced that. A minority, and it's been argued that it was a very small minority, practiced Islam. In early slave records and early plantation records, they were known as Mohammedans, but a very small number of them practiced Islam. The trauma of enslavement, the Middle Passage, led to a mixing of cultures from all these peoples from along West Africa. The practices of the peoples, as well as various, their various backgrounds, were all sort of severed, and they were all sort of just blended into this new culture, this new form of culture, this new cultural mix, this new cultural blend came about from all of that. The shock of being severed from their homelands, thrust into a society where they were worked to exhaustion, and the wholesale loss of touch with their faith and their home cultures led to this embracing of Christianity in its stead. Through slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow segregation, African Americans held to Christianity to sustain their spirits and comfort them. The church, in turn, became the focal point of the community, becoming the center of cultural, political, and social life. This is how things stood until Wallace Bard entered the equation. Now, Wallace Bard was a door-to-door silk salesperson during the Depression in Detroit. To him, Christianity represented oppression. African American worshiping a symbol of exile and servitude. To him, African American Christians, it really, to him, just epitomized their greatest status. These people in exile would worship and serve the God of their oppressor, in Bard's opinion. And Bard soon began to pitch a new call to Islam, an Islam untainted by its role in slavery, the slave trade, and Jim Crow racism. Islam was also important for historical reasons. It was not. It was not any hidden secret that Islam had been a historical enemy to Christianity, at least in the eyes of the West, as far as the Crusades were concerned. And Bard preached the incompatibility of Islam to the current African American beliefs, as Islam held that Jesus was a prophet and the Christian Bible is a holy book. He attempted to win over new converts by highlighting that by joining the Nation of Islam, but by accepting his teachings on Islam, you wouldn't necessarily be giving up all that you knew. Jesus will still be a part of. Jesus is a part of Islam. He's a prophet in there, and the Bible. Many of the teachings of the Bibles, with the exception of the New Testament, with some of those New Testament teachings, particularly the teaching about Jesus' divinity, is excluded from there. But the older books are still included in there. Now, most importantly, Islam preached an equality in the submission of all human beings before God. Fard's brand of Islam was not really rooted in Sunni, Shia, or any other branches of Islam. Fard brought a heavy mix of Christian teaching, an Afrocentric view of human creation, and denouncement of Western European civilization, and Europeans in general had blue-eyed devils. Like many new religious groups, its numbers grew informally as it developed its organizational infrastructure and liturgical texts. We'll break here, and we will continue with the with our coverage of the not only yet the Nation of Islam, but we'll continue with our broader discussion, our broader lectures on the mid-20th century civil rights movement. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you think about this lecture. Let me know what you think about the series so far. I'm Ted, and I will see you guys next time.